So it's that variation we can be looking at. And we can control for socioeconomic status and students' family background, and it still accounts for a lot of that variation. So this is over and above the socioeconomic status and background, student background. Is that the question you're asking?
So 25% seems a really huge number.
Yeah.
The little that we've read, normally it comes to about 3, 4, 5% of factors related to the school. So there are a lot of factors which affect students' achievement.
Yes.
And most of them are outside the school.
Yes.
And therefore leadership is one of the major factors within a school,
yes,
which affects student
yes.
achievement. So the question really was that 25% is it the difference in achievement due to factors within a school, or is it like overall difference?
Well, they're measured by the factors which are under the influence of the principal. So yes, within the school. Yeah, that's an important thing. So back to this model, we flag motivation as one of the key things that school leadership has an influence on that affects teacher practice. So the degree to which teachers feel motivated to do their job has a huge influence on how they actually do things. Do they feel like they're engaged? And within that, there are several aspects to motivation that we try to measure, particularly teacher efficacy, teacher trust, and context beliefs. These are all measures that are actually quite well defined from the psychological literature. Teacher efficacy is one I would flag, and I don't know if it's something that's current in your work at the moment, but I would highlight it as something that is worth paying attention to. Efficacy, self-efficacy is, from the psychology literature, is the aspect of one's beliefs about the degree to which one can do a good job, the degree to which by doing this job one can make a difference in the outcomes, and that these outcomes are important. So a degree of self-efficacy really is important in all our work. I mean, you're here because I think you're building a sense of your efficacy, your sense that, hey, I could do this. And, wow, if I did this, wouldn't this make a difference? So the degree to which you can do that motivates you to invest in your education and go out and get a job in which you're really going to change the world. If you think about the degree to which teachers feel efficacious about their work, that, hey, I could do this, and by doing this, I could really change the lives of these students. And if I were able to do that, think of the difference this community would see. So that kind of engagement in their ability to do something that is really important becomes really powerful and tends to influence the degree to which teachers do good work and want to strive to do even better. So if you can find a leader who can help teachers build their sense of self-efficacy, all of a sudden you've got a powerful lever to improve student learning. So that's one of the pieces in here. Trust is a similar one, an essential element in effective leadership, the degree to which there's trust built in the school, and that teachers trust the leader and teachers start trusting each other as well. So the next piece in this model would be the building of capacity. And this is a fairly obvious one. I think you'd all agree that the degree to which teachers have the capacity to do their job, that is, that they have the knowledge and skills, is seen as actually essential to effective classroom practice and school improvement. But the degree to which the leader has an influence on the kind of capacity of teachers is actually really important. If the leader's being simply a managerial leader, that is somebody who gets the forms filled in, does the scheduling, does the timetable and so on, but leaves the classroom practice to somebody else, then, it's not really that important. But if a leader were to pay attention to the degree to which those teachers have the capacity, have the knowledge and skills they need and so on, and that they're constantly asking, they're observing, they're trying to find out whether this happens, all of a sudden it becomes something that's important in the school, and teaching tends to improve as a result. And the third element is that there is a school setting in which teacher practices can be well supported. So there are three of these models. This last one actually looks at organizational issues. The degree to which a school has the resources to do the things that it needs to do, that there are structures in place to ensure that it happens smoothly and that there are not structural impediments to things happening, that there's a culture in there in which we believe in what we're doing, that we're going to strive to do it well, and that we're committed to ensuring that all children will learn. And these last two ones are collective measures of things we've already mentioned. But the degree to which they are collective views, first of school capacity, that is, we together have the capacity to do this well, is really important. And secondly, that we have a sense of collective capacity, that within our school, we together can work really well. And because I know that these teachers and those administrators are all working together to accomplish this, we could really do this. That all our children will learn well. Does that make sense? Clear? So this is a model of how we would understand the way that leadership has an effect on student achievement. Through building teacher capacity and motivation, which has an influence on teacher practice, which in turn has an impact on student achievement. So this is a model that we have used quite often in trying to deconstruct the way leaders actually do good work in schools and make a difference. Any questions on that? Seem to make sense? Yeah.
Just a clarificatory question. So by motivation, you don't mean the narrow sense of just inspiring others. You basically also mean, thinking about teacher practices as a whole, thinking about the setting as a whole. So motivation itself can really be deconstructed to mean several things.
It certainly can mean several things. We try to differentiate between sort of beliefs about our capacity and beliefs about the setting too, which sort of overlap in these three areas. The motivated piece has very much to do with not just, I love my work and I want to come to school every day, but that I actually have a serious engagement in the work that's beyond simply I like it. So that there's a sense that this is important to me. And that the leaders can do things to make it more important, to make it more attractive, more appealing.
But it would therefore include what precisely these practices ought to be, teacher practices.
Oh,
what
yes,
they ought to be.
yes, yes.
And how are they going to be implemented in my school setting,
Yeah.
and so on and so forth.
So that's actually a really important point, is that this is not just a model that says leaders understand how to motivate people or build capacity and so on. It means that the leaders actually understand what this is in order to build the capacity in the appropriate way, or motivate people in a way, or build a setting where this happens really well. So this assumes a sophistication of the part of the leaders, that they actually understand what we're trying to accomplish. Yeah, very nice. So that there's actually a sense that we really know what this is. We know it when we see it, we can understand it, and that's really important.
If I may make one further point, I really liked it when you said that leaders ought not to see themselves simply as managers, simply as managerial administrative leaders. I think in a setting like a school or a university, what is very important is that apart from the managerial functions, there should be a notion of academic leadership, right? So the understanding that what kind of intellect and intellectual aspirations should the school have, what kind of collective intellectual goals we have to achieve, all of that is very significant, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a very nice point. It's really important that a school be a place of inquiry, where we actually believe in, we're not treating our students like sponges, where basically they just have to absorb everything we have to impart. We're actually trying to teach them to think. We're trying to get them to challenge and think deeply about the work that we're doing, not just remember things. So if we're trying to build that spirit of inquiry, in fact, what the leadership needs to do in the school is model that kind of inquiry. So that they actually model the kind of things that we expect of the people within this. So the approach to leadership probably reflects the way we want our students to learn and the way we want our teachers to teach. So that's our model. I'm going to give you the fastest outline I can on what it is that effective leaders do, but I can lead you to a place where there's a lot more information on this. But it's important to acknowledge the kind of things that leaders do that seems to contribute to building capacity, motivation, and setting for effective teaching. The first is setting directions. This is the area where leaders focus on building a vision and setting goals and so on. And there's a body of knowledge about what it is that leaders do that can do this effectively. Secondly, developing people. This is the degree to which people not only, people who are leaders, not only work on professional development, but actually set expectations for what it is that we want teachers to do and model the kind of practice that teachers should be doing in their classroom. Redesigning the organization is a body of practices in which we build an effective school culture, in which we build structures that support good teaching and ensure that there are no barriers to effective work in the classroom. And finally, managing the instructional program is just what we were talking about, ensuring that a really good program happens in the classroom and that the leaders know what that is and are able to guide that in some way that's effective. So this is actually a huge menu. Within each of these headings, there are 4 or 5 different specific practices that we know of. So this is actually quite a catalog. In my home province of Ontario in Canada, our government sponsored leadership development program uses this as a model for what it teaches people who are going to be school leaders. They have a principal development program based on this. And they spend months trying to work through and understand this catalog of things. So it's a tall order for people to encompass. But I think an important one. It's all based on good research, mostly from my colleague Ken Leithwood, where it actually catalogs the research base that would support each of these some 23 different practices for effective school leaders. It is presumptuous of me to put this on the table and just let it sit, except to say that we should acknowledge that it exists. And on another lecture, on another time, I'll take you through this in some detail. There's actually some fascinating details in figuring out how we understand this. But at the moment, just acknowledge that we know this and understand this. So the third question that I would put on the table then is, who provides leadership, particularly in schools? Let's focus on schools. And this may seem like an obvious question because we know people who have the titles and the hierarchical power in schools, and it always starts with the principal or head teacher. It's a fairly obvious thing, but in fact there are other people there who do it as well. In the North American system, we have vice principals or assistant principals or other school administrators in formal positions. And we also have teachers, actually in a variety of situations as well. So there are teachers who are in defined roles. They may be a specialist in a particular area of practice, of literacy or math or something like that, that is used to help other teachers with their practice. But it may also be teachers working in teams who are developing a new strategy for how we address challenges that our students are having in history or something that we feel isn't being addressed. So we can put teachers together in teams, and they provide leadership for the school in ensuring that we can figure our way through this. It's also fair to acknowledge that teachers as individuals without defined roles also provide leadership. I think we can all think of a teacher who doesn't have any particular formal role in the school, but end up being hugely influential because they're an expert at how you do this. And if you ever wanted to know about that, go see that person because she could really help you figure it out. So you can think of people like that, and they end up being hugely influential in the school, even though they haven't got a formal role. We also have district leaders. In the North American system, we have 3 tiers of organization. We have the government, we have the district, and we have the school. Under this heading, I would include block leaders, cluster leaders as well. So that it's looking at the intermediate support network that helps life in the school. And they certainly are influential in what happens in the schools. So we'd also think of parents as being quite influential. I think for those of you who've worked in schools, you can think of a teacher who ends up being hugely influential, sometimes in a difficult way. But parents can actually make a huge difference in the life of schools, and they may do it as part of a school council or a parent association, but they may also just be very forceful individuals. Yes?
Give us an example of a teacher who's not in the defined role.
Well, the example I think I flagged was a teacher who's a particular expert in an area of the curriculum, say, who is really, really good at it. And if anybody in the school, any other teacher wanted to know, I don't really understand that well, go and see her, because she really knows.
So that be a specific expert at that, by qualification, perhaps, but just...
Yeah, so in our work in understanding teacher leadership, one of the most important qualifications is expertise. The degree to which the teacher is a particular expert in an area ends up being very influential. There are other teachers who are very influential, often just by force of character, and positive or negative, I have to say. You can think of teachers who are just, they've been teaching for 25 years, and I don't do anything more than that, and I'm going to give you a piece of my mind about the way things work. So that can be very influential to other teachers, but not always in a supportive way. So there are people who can be very forceful personalities that guide then a school's reaction to a new policy or a new strategy or something like that. That make sense?
So in this case, this is not a legitimate leadership.
Right. Well, sorry. I would challenge quite the turn of phrase. I would say this is not a formal leadership role, but it ends up being quite legitimate because other teachers end up being very influenced by these people, even though it may not be a formally recognized role. So that's an important distinction in the way that we understand the nature of leadership. You remember from my opening slide about the 2 pieces of leadership that that all the research tends to agree on the nature of leadership, setting directions, and influencing people. Well, these teachers end up, they can certainly set the direction, we're not doing that, and being very influential, other people listen to such a person. So the nature of leadership is not just what the head teacher does, it's actually this kind of process of influence. It can seem a bit far-fetched because we're stretching the bounds of how we understand it, but the more we start talking about, say, distributed leadership, you start then saying, well then, so what is it really? If you don't have a title, but you're still influencing people, maybe that's still leadership. So we're pushing the boundaries a little on this. We're sort of wrestling with quite how we understand this, and it is not leadership on. You could also consider the degree to which students are influential in schools. Well, hugely influential. I mean, they really make a difference. And you can think of classes, if you were a teacher, or even when you were a student, when things really worked, or classes when things never worked. And students, as individuals and as groups, actually tend to have a huge impact on the way things happen in schools. And teachers tend to spend time thinking about, oh my goodness, I've got that class again, what am I going to do? Well, that influences teacher practice in quite a significant way. There are examples where students become more explicitly involved in setting directions in the school when they're invited to give input into new plans for something happening in the school and so on. But those tend to be exceptional. We might like to encourage that more of that happen, but for the most part, I'd say that's an exception rather than the rule. So the reason I've got this long catalog of people who potentially could offer leadership in the school is that we do start talking about shared or distributed leadership. And this is a very popular concept at the moment in educational literature, educational leadership. The degree to which leadership is being shared across more people. There are two forces that seem to be making this happen. One is that the role of school leadership is becoming increasingly complex. There's certainly more managerial aspects to it, filling out forms and schedules and all that sort of stuff. But we're also asking our school leaders to be doing more things, to be more engaged in classroom practice, to be more engaged in helping develop teachers and so on. There's a lot of work to be done. And the degree to which we can start to share some of that around may help us cope with the complexity of the task. The other reason is that from my work in educational change, the theorists are saying that the degree to which you can engage teachers in important decisions about the school has a huge impact on whether things actually happen or not. Teachers, as a group, tend to be quite stubborn about things that are just dropped on them from on high. So if a teacher is just simply told, okay, here's a new part of the curriculum, you've got to do this next year, or here's a new assessment, you've got to test children this way now, they just start saying, they don't engage in this, they don't take it seriously, and they probably just rather not do it. However, if in considering whether we're going to have one of these practices, teachers are involved in making the decision about it, all of a sudden they could say, no, we can do this, we can do this, we can do this. How do we decide? Well, I think this one's the best one. What do you think? And all of a sudden it becomes a discussion about what we do. And at the end of the day, some agreement is reached and something actually happens, and they make it happen. So the degree to which teachers are engaged in some of these important decisions has a huge impact on what happens in the school. I just flagged in passing that these ideas of sharing leadership are also linked to other conceptual things. Is the concept of a professional learning community something you've been wrestling with? Well, that idea of a collaborative environment when we work together has a lot to do with sharing leadership. So it's looking at, involved in a shared vision and collaborative practices. So there's a sort of conceptual fit here in terms of something that seems quite hot. So here's some new research. Let's see what we can get through fairly briskly in terms of some data that we collected in a large 5-year study that we did in the United States. We asked teachers in schools, some hundreds of schools, I think 200 and something schools, if they could tell us the degree of influence that people in all those positions I've just listed have in the life of the school. So we asked them whether parents and groups, students, teachers, individuals, all those sort of things, whether they were influential. And they ranked them all according to the degree of influence that they had in the school. So we did a mathematical calculation on this, which summed the volume of influence by each people in each of those roles, and came up with a number that represented what we call the collective leadership. That is the volume of leadership being exercised in this school, the sum of influence from people in all those different roles. So, yeah, I mean, it's a mathematical convenience, but let me sort of unpack what we think this actually means then. So we're starting to talk about the volume of leadership being offered in schools. We did two different models for the same schools. One was an assessment of focused leadership, that is the leadership just by the head teacher or principal, and this model of collective leadership, which is the sum of all the leadership. And we compared the two of them on the outcome measures of teacher practice and student achievement. So we ran these two models in comparison and started to look at how these schools saw it. And we used this same model to assess capacity, motivation, and setting for collective leadership as for leadership from the principal. So we had two models running together in the same situations and had a sense of the degree to which one had a greater capacity for explaining student achievement over the other. And ta-da, here's the conclusion. That schools that had high collective leadership, that's high volume of leadership, had a stronger influence on student achievement than focused leadership alone. So it meant that where there was a high volume of leadership, a lot of people providing a lot of leadership, student achievement tended to be higher. Collective leadership also had a greater influence on teacher ability than focused leadership. So building teacher capacity seemed to happen more effectively where there was a high volume of collective leadership. Collective leadership had a particularly strong effect on the work setting. Think about it. I mean, if we have a school where a lot of people are engaged in leadership in our school, the setting, the environment, the school culture becomes a really different place. A place where a lot of people are engaged, a lot of things are happening, and teachers responded to that in a way that affected their practice, and students seemed to learn better. So the chain through the model seemed to work actually quite nicely. So here's a graph of the data, and let me sort of talk you through this, because there are actually a couple of insights in this that I think are really quite powerful. We divided all the schools in our sample into quintiles, depending on the levels of student achievement. So this black triangle, for instance, is the fifth quintile, which is the group of schools with the highest level of student achievement. And the black square is the quintile of students with the lowest level of student achievement. And along the bottom here, we have all the different roles that we've mentioned, starting with the district and the principal at the far end, school administrators, teachers in the middle here, parents in two groups, and students in at the end. So the obvious conclusion from this is that, first of all these lines, regardless of which quintile they were in, follows generally the same slope. Everybody thought the district leader or the school leader had the highest level of influence of anybody in the school. So that seems obvious, but I want to flag that. So very high and a lot of unanimity in this. The teacher roles here, there's starting to be some spread across this, but they're all sort of clustered in the middle. And then parents and students tend to be the least influential. This is fairly obvious. You would expect to see that. But what's interesting is that the spread starts to increase, and that schools where there is the highest level of achievement tend to be schools where there is more influence being exercised by teachers, parents, and even students, which seems quite extraordinary. So there seems to be a correlation here between the degree to which these people are involved in a high level of influence and the way students are one of the things that we conclude from this is addressing one of the challenges that we heard from the principals when we did interviews in this study. We heard a lot of principals expressing anxiety about the use of distributed leadership because they felt that they were giving away power. They felt that, well, if I'm asking all these other people to take on leadership in my school, I'm losing power. I will lose control. They'll just run away with the school. So what we learned from these data is that, in fact, the principal remains the most influential person in the school, regardless of the amount of other leadership that's being exercised. So the principal is losing nothing and potentially gaining something. So I would say this curious turn of phrase, actually I think is quite insightful. High performance schools are fatter, not flatter. In the organizational theory, people talk a lot about the flatness of the organization. A flat organization is one where there's very little gap between the top of the hierarchy and the bottom of the hierarchy. Well, some people say that by distributing leadership, we're actually flattening the organization. In our data, we would say they're not actually flattening the organization. They're increasing the volume of leadership, but maintaining a hierarchical relationship. So this isn't becoming a sort of happy collaborative environment where everybody just sort of gets along and there's no leadership power. There's lots of power being thrown around here, but there are lots of people doing it. So that's the significant difference. And what we feel from our research is that when a lot of people are involved in this way, it tends to influence teacher practice that influences student achievement. Yes?
Could you possibly clarify a little more on your second point where collective leadership has a direct influence on teacher abilities? Are you talking about teacher competencies or teacher satisfaction? How do you define that?
I'm conscious that in 7 minutes we have to wrap this up. So I'm going to give you a short answer and maybe we can talk a little more about it later. The degree to which teachers become engaged in important decisions in the school seems to affect the way that they're engaged in their classroom practice. So where they feel like they're being influential in guiding the school and saying they're being heard when they say this school must have this or we need more of that or something must be done, and they're heard and that makes a difference, they feel okay, and I go back into my classroom and what I do in my classroom seems to be different because all of a sudden I'm feeling like, hey, with my sense of efficacy, my sense of confidence in what I do, it seems to make a big difference on the way I teach to my students. Conversely, one can imagine that a school in which teachers are not listened to, they have no input, and stuff is just thrown at them, they're just going to go and close the door of the classroom and just do whatever the teachers do. So that seems to be the most direct correlation. I think there are other parts to it as well that I think end up being quite powerful. Yes?
Collective leadership is, I mean, if there were more district officials vis-a-vis more students, vis-a-vis more parents, vis-a-vis more teachers, which are creating the volume of the collective leadership.
So I can't give you a categorical answer on that. I don't think our data would give that answer. I could imagine that it could be influential. I mean, if you have a really high level of parent influence and not much teacher influence, it would be a very odd school. And one could imagine that perhaps wouldn't be very effective. You should bear in mind that this research was done in the United States in an environment in which they're trying to promote parental involvement. So that is seen as a good thing. So the way that schools engage parents in the life of the school is being promoted as something that is worthy, and that teacher participation is seen as worthwhile as well. So both of those seem to be getting higher, and our data seem to suggest that they're higher in schools that had higher student achievement. I should put one caveat on the table here, and that is that there's a piece of this that you need to challenge, and that is that we haven't demonstrated causality in the direction of the model. There is a very strong argument that high-performance schools tend to engage teachers more and have higher parent participation. And this model doesn't, it shows that they're correlated, but it doesn't show which is causing the other. So that's something to challenge in this data. But the association is strong, and I would say that it still supports promoting the idea that more leadership is better leadership in the school.
Wondering, say, if you look at this model in a Indian context, there are two things which seem like different, at a very broad level. One, context. Two issues, just at a very broad level. The context of influence. If I look at influence without a context, that I don't know whether we are looking at only formal influence channels, because in terms of, say, if you go to a school level also and look at particular practices, there might be situations where informal channels of influence reverse the hierarchy, formal hierarchies.
So more power, say, to teachers.
Yeah, it is over. So if there is a politically connected teacher,
yes,
then even a district level official is very wary of that, and particularly if that teacher is part of a political network at the so how would that shape out? So would context as well as how would, and are you talking about influence only in a very formal sense, in an official flow of?
well, definitely not a formal sense. In a lot of what we're talking about, like the influence of most parents and students, for instance, is informal. Tends not to be assertive in a very formal way, and yet tends to be influential nonetheless. So I'd say that we certainly encompass the informal influence. I have to say in this research we didn't come across many instances of what you're talking about the politically connected parent who was able to go, or teacher who was able to go around the head teacher in order to get some influence from somewhere else. It must happen, I'm sure it happens. But we didn't see that, and it didn't come out in this data. Yeah.
In connection to Rahul's question, I just had to, I know about American school model very well, and it's through the Wallace Foundation documentary. So in that it came out that the school principals are motivated and they want to become principal. Whereas in India, according to, as per my experiences, that the teachers are promoted to become principals. There's no, as such, till now there was no training of school principals as school principals how to manage, how will you work with teachers. There are teachers who are promoted to become school principals, and then it follows into becoming district officials and education officers. So one thing is that in in one of these states, the principals are given an administrative duty, that they are the administrators, they don't have to become instructional leaders. Yeah, and the other thing about, and the teachers do have a certain autonomy, but the principals to be able to negotiate with the teachers, so they cannot hire them or they cannot, ask them to leave if they are not performing. So that is one, I can call it a limitation with the Indian school context. So in that, in this reference, can we say that it is very contextual because the kind of system we have, like you were also emphasizing that the focus of in America is also that you make contacts with the community, though it is still coming into discussions. It has been there, but still into practice we are still working on it. Is it very contextual?
It's highly contextual, but I wouldn't dismiss it on that merit. In the North American context, leadership development isn't that old. I mean, it's now accepted practice, and pretty well all school formally head teachers, principals are expected now to have some training, and they're probably expected to already have a degree, and might even be expected to have a second degree. So there are, but that's certainly a change within the last 20 or 30 years. So it's been a recent evolution. It's not something that's always been there. So that's part of their context, which they've got to now. but it wasn't that long ago when this was not the case. Yes.
See, you spoke very eloquently about shared, distributed, democratic team or teacher leadership. And I have a question with regard to that. The question comes from our own contexts in this country. I don't work in this area, but what I have seen of these things in schools, colleges, other institutions, is that this kind of a model where leadership is shared, distributed, democratic, works very well, where all the members have more or less the same sort of ability, and that ability is of a fairly high order. But wherever there is a high degree of mediocrity, mediocrity itself leads to politicking within an outside group, and therefore, this model in such situations doesn't seem to work very well.
So I think I agree with your premise, but I would say, well, there are two parts to what I would say. The first is that one of the things that we have been aspiring to do in the North American context is actually improve education. So ensuring that schools where the level of teaching is mediocre are actually promoted to actually strive for excellence. And one of the ways that that happens is that you actually start the difficult conversations about what does good practice look like, how do we get it, how do we learn it, who knows better, could I see what you do, those kind of conversations. The mediocre schools that you describe tend to be places where teachers are isolated, where the doors are closed, each teacher does their own thing in their own classroom, and there's no conversation. If they start to talk about what happens in their classroom and trade stories of, well, this really worked for me, and there's a really good thing that I saw once where this happened. When you have those conversations, people then start to aim higher in terms of what they're doing. So the mechanics of that tend to be something that is self-promoting. It ends up being a mechanism that starts with mere collaboration, but ends up people aspiring to teach better. So I would say that it's a mechanism. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but if the critical mass is in favor of mediocrity, if in a team of 20, 16, 14, 17 people are fairly mediocre, they won't allow the conversations to happen.
And it may need outside force in order to make it happen. In the North American context, we would probably try and ensure that many of those teachers got moved around. Well, I mean, that sounds a little cynical, but the moving of teachers is not just a matter of getting rid of people we consider to be dead wood. It may sometimes happen that way, but in fact what it's doing is changing the environment in which if there are 14 teachers out of 20 that are really not doing well, if we could move half of those to other schools where they're going to be challenged by a different culture and bring in some new, stronger teachers, that would tip the balance in this school in order to make it a place where mediocrity is not an acceptable culture.
Yes. One next. About your methodology, whatever it is, of course, possibly you'll unpackage it a little bit, but what I want to ask is that whatever it be, apart from that, what you said, is it also based on a very detailed understanding and description of what various individual teachers do in a school, what various parents do, what the principal head teacher does, virtually a day-to-day thick description of what is happening in a school. Do you think that kind of methodology will sit well with what you've shown us?
So what I've presented here is actually a statistical analysis from questionnaires,
yes,
surveys of teachers.
Yes.
So this is sort of presenting within the limits of a statistical analysis. This is what these data said. In addition to that, we did school visits where we interviewed teachers and principals, parents, community leaders within schools 3 times over a period of time to ask just those questions about, so who's influential, what are they doing, what difference is it making, how is this playing out, and so on. So we gathered that data and we observed cluster practice. We went in and watched teachers teach and drew conclusions about the level of capacity, the level of ability that these teachers seem to have. So we were able to sort of pull all that together. I have to say this is the most complex, well, one of two most complex projects I've ever been involved in. 5 years, so longitudinal study, looking at leadership at the government level, at the district level, at the school level, and at the classroom level, with surveys, with interviews, classroom visits, just a whole body of data. I mean, we have a room full of data from this. It's incredibly rich. So this is the study that, somebody mentioned earlier, the Wallace Foundation study called Learning from Leadership. And it's available online, so there's a huge amount of it that's available. And there's a book now that's been published on this that you can buy. Just really great. So this is just a tip of a huge iceberg of analysis that we've done on this great data set. It gives a lot of different pictures about these kinds of things. I'm already into overtime on this. I can't believe it. Shut up, Blair. Thank you all for your patience. I'm around a bit today and tomorrow afternoon, so if anybody has any